Hey YouTube, I have a very special treat for you today. So sit down, grab some popcorn, and get ready to enjoy the show.
Hey guys, what's up? It's the Tominator back with another one here for you. Today I'm very excited to be kicking off a new series. It's going to be the best poses of all time. So today we're going to be checking out the best front double bicep pose. Who's the guy throughout bodybuilding history that hits it the best? Okay, and we're going to be doing a separate video for each of the mandatory poses all the way through to the most muscular. And, needless to say, I got a lot of bodybuilders to feature because there's been a lot of excellent talent over the years in the 50-plus history of the Mr. Olympia and so on. So, got a ton of pictures to go through. And, I'm not putting them in any order. So, it would just be such a monumental task. And at the end of the day, it would just be pretty subjective and arbitrary anyway. So, I don't think that would add a ton of value to try and order them all. But I'm not copping out completely. At the end of the video, I will give you my #1 pick for the best front double biceps of all time, so stay tuned for that. I think you'll be surprised. And yeah, without further ado, let's jump into this thing. So first off, we got Larry Scott, aka the Golden Boy, and he was the first Mr. Olympia back in 1965-66, as you see here, and he had a very impressive set of arms for his time. Not a lot of photos could be found of him though, so let's move on to Frank Zane. Everybody's familiar with this guy. They called him the chemist because he liked to use a lot of supplements and aminos, which is very unusual for his time. But I prefer to think of him more as the father of aesthetics because he's just the kind of the image of a Greek statue, right? I don't think anybody's really kind of matched that sculpturesque posing that Frank brought. And he looks really impressive in these front double bicep poses here. Then we got Serge Nubret, and I apologize for this blurry quality, but there's not a lot of photos that you can find of him hitting mandatory poses, because with Serge it's all kind of more artistic non-mandatory poses, and him just standing there, He was a very aesthetic guy, kind of the forebearer of Flexweiler in a lot of ways. We got Ed Corney. This was a guy from the 1970s. He was featured in Pumping Iron, where Arnold was sitting around with a bunch of other bodybuilders and just admiring his posing. He was like, "That's what I call posing." Because Ed was one of the best posers ever. He really kind of posed in a very dramatic fashion, and he looks pretty impressive here in the front double bicep, right? Then we got Mike Mentzer, another guy from the 70s, who many feel should have probably won the Mr. Olympia in 1980, but didn't, because politics got in the way. And the golden days indeed. Back when guys had streamlined waists, they all looked athletic. None of these big lumbering, insulin pregnant-looking motherfuckers that we see today. Everything was very artistic, very classic, very classy. And here he is standing next to another guy, and Dennis Tinorino. This guy has an interesting story because he was actually a pimp in the literal sense of the word. So he was involved in an escort service back in the 70s, ended up getting busted, thrown in jail while he was there. A preacher came up to him and was like, "Oh, God's got really good things in store for you." So Dennis is like, "Oh, okay, I'm going to convert to Christianity now and become a preacher and write books on this shit." So that's his little background. But here we got Danny Padilla. Look at that crazy vacuum and the shredded legs. He looks phenomenal, doesn't he? This guy was only about 5'2", and they called him the Giant Killer, a very apt name because, I could definitely see him taking on guys who are like a foot taller than him because he's got the full package, just total development, very proportional. Look at the midsection. Look at the calves, right? He looks amazing in this pose. We got Bob Paris, one of the most aesthetic guys from the 80s and a really good poser to boot. Looking really good on the beach here. Then we got Francis Benfato, yet another guy from the 80s who was very aesthetic and a good poser. And very streamlined waist. He's got an excellent X-frame here. You can see that's the combination of the V-taper and the outer quad sweep. So he looks really phenomenal in this pose to me. We got Matt Mendenhall, and believe it or not, this guy never got his pro card. He was competing back in the, I believe, early 80s, and they didn't hand out pro cards like candy like they do nowadays. So this guy, for some reason, just never qualified, but he had a really good front double bicep pose as well. We got Mike Ashley. This guy ended up winning the 1990 Arnold Classic, which was just the second time that they hosted that contest. And yet another streamlined waist. Are we detecting a pattern here, guys? To me, like a streamlined waist, really good arms, and a good V-taper is kind of the hallmarks, the most important features of a front double bicep. So we got Nimrod King. Now this guy's name just kind of made me laugh because who freaking names their son Nimrod, right? But apparently, I looked it up. You Google it, and this is actually a character from Scripture, the Old Testament. Something about Noah's Ark, yada yada. So I guess his parents were really religious. But anyway, crazy quad development for him. I think he was competing in the 80s or early 90s, so pretty good leg development for his era, and the arms look good too. Then we got this guy, Edgar Fletcher. What an epic front double bicep pose. If I could have found more pics of this guy, he might have taken that #1 spot. But as it was, I don't think this guy ever turned pro either, and I couldn't find any other pictures of him that were any good. So without further evidence, I really can't give him the #1 spot based on one photo. But if I was just gonna say, like, if I could do that just based on one photo alone, this guy might take the cake, because this is absolutely outstanding. Super streamlined waist, super tight waist, really good arms, just overall super amazing shape, right? And we got Momo Benaziza, Myron himself over there. And this guy, aside from his name, which is just fun to say, Momo Benaziza, he was a very impressive bodybuilder. He was kind of short and stocky, but super thick and dense. Kind of like that deuce I dropped off at the pool this morning. But in all seriousness, he was a really good pro. Had amazing back as well. You can't see it here, but the legs are pretty awesome. And this guy was just thickly built, man. Like, talk about a giant killer. Look at the midsection too. Then we got Charles Clermont. And to me, he's kind of like the white version of Flexweiler. I see a lot of similarities here in his shape, his overall aesthetics, the way he hits the pose. Very reminiscent of Flex to me. I don't know if you guys see that as well. But he was competing around the same time as Flexweiler too, back in the 90s. And he looks just outstanding in this front double biceps pose. What do you think? Here's Kevin Lavroni. Everyone knows about him, especially now that he just made his comeback. But back in the day, his front double bicep pose was quite an epic scene. He had better legs than he does now. His waist was more streamlined. And yeah, look at the wheels. They definitely kind of fell off in the later years of his career. But, back in the day, he was definitely quite an impressive sight. He's got the elbows raised here. Still looks really good. Here he is standing next to Shawn Rhoden, hitting an impressive vacuum shot. And a larger version of Flexweiler. And here we go with Shawn again with his awesome flat top hair. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air style. And, Shawn's one of my favorite bodybuilders of all time because he just has the total package. He doesn't, as I said in another video, he doesn't really have any weaknesses, no weak poses. He had everything. He had the conditioning, the shape, the aesthetics, the proportion, and he could pose really amazingly. And, I mean, look at this. This is like Hall of Fame type material right here, right? Here he is standing next to another giant killer in Lee Priest, and look at the guns on Lee, man. You can, this is another giant killer because he's only about 5'4" as Lee Priest, but the arms are some of the best in history, no questions about it. Legs are really good too, but the biceps, the triceps, the forearms, man. If he could have just had a little bit more width through the chest and a better back, he would have been unstoppable. Then we got another Lee Labrada. They called him the mass with class, and even though he doesn't look very massive by today's standards, back in the 80s and early 90s when he was competing, this was a pretty decent level of mass, especially on a shorter guy like himself. And he had a very complete package as well. Brought the conditioning, had the total development. Not so sure about that stash, though. That's looking a little sketch, but hey, it was a different time, right? And we got another Lee Haney. There seems to be a lot of Lees throughout the history of bodybuilding. A lot of good bodybuilders named Lee, but this is probably the best of the bunch. The 8-time Mr. Olympia, Lee Haney, shares the record with Ronnie Coleman. For those of you who, were living under a rock and didn't know that. But check out the awesome, V-taper, the lat sweep he's got. That's why I had to include him in this list. And here he is rocking the vacuum while doing it. Always makes you look more impressive when you can hit a vacuum because it kind of puffs up your upper body and makes you look even bigger and fuller than you are. Here he is standing next to a young Dorian Yates, and he's smoking him, in my opinion. He's obviously bigger. Look at the arm size difference. Dorian might have legs on him, but that's it. And this would have been probably 1990, somewhere around there, because, Dorian doesn't have his trademark mass, which we would grow to, expect from him. But here he is when he became this, right? And these are the famous 1993 gym photo shoot that he did before the 1993 Mr. Olympia, and he looked absolutely just stellar. This was unprecedented mass, And unfortunately, he could never kind of duplicate it well on stage, because here he is in contest shape, probably the same year, might have been a year before, but anyway, he's looking noticeably smaller and flatter. Still impressive, but then he would kind of devolve into this, unfortunately, because he had that bicep tear, and then he tore his tricep again just a few weeks before the '97 Mr. Olympia, which was this contest. So he looked kind of like hot garbage, right? But Nasser's killing him. Somehow Dorian still ended up winning the show. Go figure. And this is Nasser El Somebody. First, should have been first at the '97 Mr. Olympia too, but I mean, look at the arms, the legs on this guy. He was just an absolute monster. The biggest guy competing in the '90s, arguably along with Paul Dillette and maybe Dorian, but I think he was probably the biggest overall. Because look at the legs. I mean, the calves are just ridiculous. The overall thickness on this guy. I mean, this photo looks a little Photoshopped, but I don't know, man. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But maybe he's just that pumped up and full and good lighting in this shot. Wouldn't be surprised because he had some crazy body parts. Here's Chris Cormier, one of the last guys who could rock a vacuum, along with Shawn Ray. And like Shawn Ray, he didn't really have a weak body part. He was very well balanced. Here he is again. Probably earlier in his career, he looks a little smaller. And he was also one of the strongest bodybuilders ever. Let's jump forward in time a little bit to present day. This is Brandon Curry. And he has a very impressive set of guns, delts. Even the chest looks super impressive, which is kind of rare in a front double bicep pose. But his chest really stands out to me here. And I feel like Brandon Curry is one of the best overall packages in today's sport. It's just that he doesn't place higher because he can never really nail his conditioning. But the shape, the mass, the balance, the symmetry, all of that's there. He just needs to really dial it in, because he's got a really impressive front double bicep pose. Another guy who impressed me a few years ago when he debuted at the Olympia, Lionel Bayecki. And what's so notable about this guy is his very streamlined waistline. This is kind of a dying breed in today's sport, so I got to give him props for the aestheticism there. Justin Compton, another newcomer, just debuted a few years ago. And like Brandon Curry, he's got some very impressive arms and delts, and he also can't really, his downfall thus far has been his lack of conditioning as well. He just can't seem to kind of dial it in properly. But he's got pretty impressive front double bicep pose. We got Tony Freeman. This is an older guy. He's been competing for a long time now. Same vintage as Dexter Jackson. So that tells you how long he's been around. And they call him the X-Man, for that impressive X-frame. His lat, his V-taper combined with his outer quad sweep. And his arms look really impressive in these shots as well. Then we got Dexter Jackson himself, the Blade. Now, he's got one of the most unique front double biceps in history. It just doesn't look like anybody else. If you traced an outline of him, you would instantly know it's Dexter, right? Those really flaring lats that kind of attach a little high, but he still makes it work. And crazy arm development, just awesome sweep in those bellies there. Good delts. The midsection is very unique as well. Yeah, Dexter's got one of the best front double biceps in history, in my opinion. This guy surprised me. This is actually Bob Ciccarello, the guy who does a lot of the announcing at the Olympias these past few years. This is the dude back in the day, back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and he surprised me because he looks really good in this front double bicep. He's got pretty good arm development, super wide through the lats, pretty good legs. He looks solid. Shout out to Bobby C. Then we got Mike Matarazzo, and this guy looks absolutely ridiculous. Those arms are retarded, right? It looks Photoshopped, but it is not. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm like 95% sure, because here he is again. His arms were just that stupidly large. They're like Rolly Winkler level of mass. And certainly not one of the most aesthetic guys going in this video, but I had to throw him in here for the arms alone. Here he is standing next to another guy with some similar attributes in Paul DeMaio. And they called him Quadzilla. You can see why right here in this photo, but Paul also had a really sick set of triceps. And the only thing I don't like about him in this pose is his arms look way too short compared to the rest of his body. But other than that, he looks pretty outstanding to me. Then we got John Sherman, a lesser-known guy who competed in the early 90s, not for very long, but he was a really short guy. He looks very well-proportioned. You couldn't really tell it from this when he's standing on his own. But when he's standing next to other guys, he gets dwarfed, right? There he is, Andre Munzer on his left, Charles Clermont in the center, Milos Sarcev, and that guy on the far right, I don't even know who that is, so if you do, let me know in the comments, because he looks pretty impressive in this pose as well. They called him John, so his name was John Sherman. They called him the Sherman Tank. And here he is blowing Mr. Olympia Phil Heath out of the water, if you ask me. But, keep in mind these photos aren't to scale, because John would probably barely come up to Phil's shoulder, so Phil would be dwarfing him. But I think John looks better, just shape-wise. The waistline is much tighter, so. But then again, Phil back in the day, this is 2013, just, a couple years ago, I feel like he was rocking this pose much better than he does now. His arms look more impressive here. He's got crazy leg development. He doesn't really get enough credit for his legs, I don't think. But when you have arms that are that outstanding, that kind of mass, shape, and definition, you might get overlooked when it comes to other body parts, right? And yeah, just a sick set of guns on Phil. Some of the best forearms and triceps of all time. Here he is at the 2008 Ironman. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that looks like the backdrop and the lighting for that show. And yeah, Phil was just bringing down the house with those arms. Then we got another Phil Hill. I never even heard of this guy before I started doing some research to make this video, but he looks really good in the front double bicep too. I think this guy was from the early 90s, late 80s. He looks like that vintage to me. I'm not sure exactly, but he looks like a happy camper, don't he? Kind of the opposite of this man, Shawn Rhoden, who's just mean-mugging everybody. But he has a really good front double bicep pose, one of the best in the business today. I really like how he hits it, and he's got an outstanding midsection. Probably the best midsection going today. Here he is standing next to Flexweiler, to which he's often compared. But let's face it, there's only ever going to be one Flex. Here's the Sultan of Symmetry. He's got perfect symmetry, right? Perfect shape, perfect aesthetics. Says second place here. This was probably the 1993 Mr. Olympia, but I feel like he probably deserved first because he really was the image of perfection, right? Here he is on the beach, still looking incredible despite having much less mass. And, here he is when he packed on more muscle, and he also looked incredible. Looked good no matter what. He could pretty much do no wrong in my book. Even when he was pumping his arms full of synthol and his delts too, he still looked really good. So Flexweiler, one of the best ever. We got another Flex Lewis. This guy is the reigning champ. Actually, I don't know if he's still the reigning champ because I don't really follow the 212 men's division, but I do believe his reign's been going on for around as long as Phil's. And you can see why. He's got some very impressive attributes. Very good arms, legs, back. And he looks pretty solid in the front double bicep pose for a shorter guy. Jason Huh. Huh? Yeah, that's his last name. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but it's spelt Huh. So Jason Huh, he has a pretty sick pair of arms, especially the forearms. He looks really solid in this pose. And, even the beard looks outstanding. Even the beard's on steroids. So, he's rocking a pretty impressive front double bicep pose. Even sporting the cheetah print slippers like a boss in the kitchen. Then we got Rolly Winkler, the guy with the best arms in the business, in my opinion. Probably, easily some of the best guns of all time. No questions about it. I mean, this looks Photoshopped, but I really doubt it is because he looks like this all the time. Here he is, absolutely destroying Dennis Wolf, so a notable omission there. Yes, I did not include Wolf in this countdown because, look at that. Look at the asymmetries in the arms, the high insertions in the lats. He has no left calf. Come on, he doesn't make the cut. But another blonde mass monster, and Jay Cutler did, because look at those legs, man, and the arms too, the tremendous width through the shoulders and the lats. Here he is in 2001, still looking like an absolute beast. One of the best mass monsters ever. Look at the feathering in the quads, too. Then we have Ronnie Coleman. This guy was, look at the peaks on him, right? He had so many notable body parts and was so solid in a lot of poses. Look at the quads. Obviously the back, although we're talking about the front here today. So one of the best front double biceps ever, in my opinion. I especially liked him in his younger days when he had a more streamlined waist because he really looked more aesthetic. Like in this pose right here, this is my favorite of the bunch because look how much more aesthetic he looks with that tighter midsection, right? And the arms really jump out at you more. But unfortunately, he kind of, just became a complete monster later in his career. Still looked impressive, but the aesthetics just weren't there anymore. And then we got Kai Green, the closest thing to Ronnie Coleman these days, because he's got a lot of similar features, namely the bicep peak, the crazy back and lat development, and the insane thighs. Even from the back, the glutes too, the hams. And Kai's always been kind of an unorthodox poser. very creative, does his own thing. Here he is hitting kind of artistic version of front double bicep. And look at the peaks on this guy. Those arms look fake. They look completely photoshopped, but that is legit. He just has that kind of crazy mass in his arms, and very outstanding. Then we got another mass monster. This guy was back from the 1990s, Victor Richards. And I don't believe he ever formally competed in the IFBB, but man, he should have, because he could have done some serious damage in that Olympia lineup back then. Because he was on the same level of mass as guys like Nasser and Paul Dillette, Dorian. He could have really been a serious threat with that combination of shape and mass, overall development. Then we got Paul Dillette. They called him Freakenstein for that Frankenstein-looking rectangle of a head he's got there. But crazy physique on this guy, just insane arms, the legs, everything. It's just a shame he couldn't hit a pose to save his life. He was always shaking like a chain-link fence, He couldn't hold poses, and that really cost him. Otherwise, he would have placed much higher than he did, because his physique is just absolutely outrageous. And he was towering over most guys too, so he had the height and the size advantage. Just couldn't pose. It's unfortunate. But here he is. That was Vince Taylor next to him, and here's Vince Taylor again. Also rocking a very impressive front double bicep. He had some really good arms. And we got the myth himself, Sergio Oliva. Some of the best triceps of all time. He actually had the tightest waistline of any Mr. Olympia ever, if you can believe that. Even smaller than Frank Zane's. And you can see it here. You can see how tight his waist is, and look at the tricep sweep, right? Here he is standing next to his nemesis, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And you can notice the notable difference between the waistlines, right? Like Arnold, his waist is super tight, but genetically speaking, it was a little bit wide compared to guys like Sergio and a lot of guys in his day. So in his Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding, Arnold actually mentioned that, he was self-conscious about his wide waist, and that's why he always twisted a little bit in his poses. But look at this shot. He really hit the pose so well. He doesn't have the best symmetry, the best proportions maybe. His balance might be a little off. Like his biceps are definitely overpowering his triceps here. But I don't know. The overall effect is still just incredible. I feel like there's something ineffable about his poses. His front double bicep pose in particular that just makes it stand out from a lot of the rest of the guys. He's definitely, I haven't ordered this list, but he would definitely be way up there. Probably in the top 5, And who wouldn't want to look like this guy, right? He's got such amazing aesthetics. And, he's so full and thick through the chest and the lats. Crazy peak. This is Hall of Fame material right here, like rocking a bit of a vacuum. He looks absolutely outstanding. But, in my opinion, Robby Robinson is just slightly better because he has a tighter waistline, which accentuates his V-taper. His arms were probably just as good as Arnold's. Plus, he's got that sweet fro, man. So, bonus points for that. But look at the V-taper and the vacuum, the bicep peak. We got him absolutely murdering Ferrigno and Boyer Co. And, looking like an absolute pimp on the beach with that fro and that stash. He's got the body of a god. This is absolutely remarkable. But not as good as this gentleman. This is my undisputed #1 pick. Gregg Valentino, largest arms in the world. How can you go wrong with this, guys? Who wouldn't want to look like this man right here? Look at the bulging biceps. Crazy tricep sweep. What a monster. #1 pick, hands down. You guys can't even argue that shit. Yeah, who the fuck are we kidding? That's a joke. Obviously, this guy's a clown, and he's not #1. Get his oily ass out of here. This is the real #1, Mr. Brian Buchanan. Who? Yeah, I never even heard of him either before I started Googling and doing some research on this shit, but when I did, Brian Buchanan's name came up again and again, and you can see why. I mean, this looks photoshopped. Look at that tight waistline. V-taper like no other. Just no one, he really stood out to me from the entire pack. It was almost kind of an easy #1 pick, despite all the amazing guys we just saw. Because look, I mean, each of his arms is like the size of his waist, for God's sake. It's just incredible. I mean, have you guys ever seen a V-taper like this, arms like that, compared to a waist like what he has? And his proportions and shape are just spot on. So this is my #1 pick. Let me know in the comments if you agree. Let me know if I missed anybody, because I'm sure I did. But, that's it for the front double bicep pose. Best one's going to Brian Buchanan. And next video, I'll be talking about the best front lat spread. So until then, I'm the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.